Okay, we'll get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first Independent Scientific Advisory Group webinar of the new year. Thank you all for joining us. Just a minute of introduction. The Independent Scientific Advisory Group, or I.S.A.G, is a multidisciplinary all-island group of scientists, academics and researchers who together are advocating for a SARS-CoV-2 elimination strategy for the island of Ireland. So you can see that we have a large number of our group members here this morning. I'm chairing this session. My name is Clare Kelly. I'm an associate professor in the School of Psychology and the Department of Psychiatry at the School of Medicine in Trinity College, Dublin. Before we get started with today's webinar, I just want to direct your attention to the Q&A function in Zoom. So if you have any questions during any of the presentations, you can pop them in there and we'll do our best to address them later in the Q&A section of the webinar. So since our last I.S.A.G webinar, which was on New Year's Eve, the situation here has, of course, deteriorated really significantly. We've gone from being the country with one of the lowest COVID-19 cases per capita in Europe to the country with the highest rate of infection in the world. Our health service is under unprecedented pressure with 1,750 patients currently hospitalized with COVID-19, 158 of whom are in ICU. And the Deputy CMO, Ronan Glynn, has told us to brace ourselves for high numbers of COVID-19 related deaths in the coming days. This dire situation has forced the closing of schools, and so families all over Ireland now find ourselves back in the same situation that we were in last March, April, May and June, juggling our jobs, childcare and learning. So closing schools was absolutely necessary given the situation, but there are important questions that we'd like to consider. You know, what was the impact of last year's school closure on children and families? And how can children and families stay resilient in the face of this challenge? And how can we get schools open again? So today, we at I.S.A.G are really pleased to host two educational specialists, Dr. Jennifer Symonds of UCD's School of Education and Simon Lewis, who is principal of Carlow Educate Together Primary School and creator and host of the Unshaw.net podcast. So they're going to talk to us about what we can learn from last year's lockdown and the move to remote learning in terms of its impact on children, parents and educators. But before we go to them, we're going to hear from I.S.A.G members and mathematical scientists, Paul Dempsey and James Merrick, who are going to talk about the current situation and projections, including the impact of that new, more transmissible variant B117. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. I'm just going to share screen. Okay, so just to go through briefly what happens. This here, we have a graph of the amount of cases per capita for some key age groups collected together based on how similar they were to each other. The scale we use here is called a logarithmic scale. Things go up in multiples rather than just adding up. We use this because it becomes easier to identify patterns on problems like infectious diseases where the spread multiplies rather than going from just 1 to 1. So I suppose the key things to look as to when this situation really started to deteriorate is all the way back start of December when the shops reopened, nearly exactly when you would expect them to have an impact. There was an impact straight away on the extra socialization, from that in terms of the 15 up to 64-year-olds had a similar impact. The younger cohorts, the children and the over 65s had a delayed response, which is what you'd expect at that. When dining reopened, then we got a really, really aggressive growth pattern. Unfortunately, we can't tell exactly what has happened in the bit in between, because between having to stop close contact testing and reduced testing in and around Christmas, telling exactly what has happened is very, very difficult to say. But we do know that coming into that week of Christmas, we were in a very bad state. So what we tried And on top of this, we have a new variant into the mix, which doesn't have a role before Christmas, but is going to start to have one since Christmas, and will have a very, very prominent role this month and onwards. Why we say it didn't have much of an influence pre-Christmas, it depends on how much more transmissible this is. So the issue with this new variant isn't that it makes people any more sick, from what we can see. It's that it's easier to give to somebody else and to pick up from somebody else. So in this case, where you might have just given it from one person to 2 people, it might be a case that you're giving it from 1 person to 3 people now, or maybe even 1 to 3.5, something slightly more than that. So what you have is virtually none of it in this country at the beginning of December. And then we have measurements just before Christmas of pretty much very, very little, not really any detectable amounts. And it shoots up. And again, in the next week or so, it could be up above 60% of our cases are related to this new variant. That's one way. Another set of theory says it's 70% more easy to transmit. The problem is both at the moment, both of them fit well with the Irish data, and there's just no real clarity on which one is what. So you kind of should be taking the principle of trying to be as safe as we can and base our assumptions on this 70% one, which is what a lot of people seem to be doing at the moment in other countries. What we think happened over Christmas, in the last period, when we tried to model it, was we saw normal kind of growth from shopping initially, and then very fast growth from indoor dining. And then just around Christmas, with mass gatherings of people in their own homes, a really extreme event where there was lots of transmission going on. We heard from GPs that there was a lot of people in the same family, much more than had previously happened, getting infected. So they all get infected. It wouldn't show up straight away in cases. What happens is it takes not everybody gets sick the same in the same time, so it spreads out a little bit. So we hope to see in the next, and have seen, is a pretty quick drop in cases. And if B117 wasn't in the mix, we'd hope that the current measures will be enough to see us to really know numbers at the end of February. However, with B117 being so much easier to transmit between people, depending on what the actual values come out, we can either see we're going to leave ourselves at a very high steady rate for a month or so, or if it turns out to be the worst case scenario, we're going to have within another week or 2 into a case of going back up again. I'm going to hand over to James now to explain why we think our current measures might not be enough.
Thank you, Paul. So this was last slide of our situation update is traffic levels. And this is from the N7 and a selection of Wednesdays. So if we look at the top 2 lines, they're pre-COVID traffic levels. So this time last year and then early March 2020. Now, if we look at the green line, that's basically where we are at, the sort of traffic levels we were seeing at the moment. So yeah, significant reduction from pre-COVID levels. But when you look at the yellow line, that would be the kind of maybe the harshest period of the lockdown last year in April, and we're basically in those sort of daylight working hours. We're double waking hours. We're double those levels of that period. So the levels we're seeing now are more aligned with, say, a Wednesday, late March. Now at that point, schools and pubs were closed, but the R number was still greater than 1, so the virus was still increasing. But traffic levels are a proxy for humans interacting. So clearly, at the end of trips, things have changed now. We are all more aware. We wear masks. We try and do our social commercial business at the end of the trip outdoors. So the question is, maybe these sort of traffic levels, with the implicit level of interaction these traffic levels imply, maybe with the increased awareness and measures people take, maybe we can, R's below 1, but and maybe okay, and it's just in the corner of the slide there. But when you're with this B117 adds a new kicker, I suppose is one word to put it, where this level of interaction implied by these traffic levels may not be enough. And so then you're looking at maybe a requirement to move back to the sort of April lockdown measures on the yellow line, and then a reference of probably the absolute minimum you could face in society for a short period would be the sort of levels we saw on Easter Monday last year. And so the last point I wanted to make is that you know, that kind of feeding into the rest of the webinar, it's just, we have this uncertainty about the variant and its implications, but it's also moving into the issue of schools and any other interaction. It's just the importance of measures, just the importance of measures that we know about, ventilation, CO2 monitors, masks, social distancing, things we can do for any of those interactions that are happening in society to reduce the chance of transmission. So I'll pass it on at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul and James. That's a quite sobering presentation. I think these insights are really important at this point because it's possible that we'll start, you know, in terms of the case numbers, we may start to see some positive signs and people will start pushing to reopen things again. And I think it's really important that that people are aware of these data and the projections. So now we're going to turn to the main focus of today's webinar on education. And we're going to start with Dr. Jennifer Symonds, who's a lifespan developmental psychologist of engagement and well-being and an associate professor in UCD's School of Education, where she leads the Engagement and Learning Schools and Societies Lab. She's the Director of Research on the Doctorate in Educational Psychology at UCD, Director of the Centre for Longitudinal Studies in Ireland, and has a number of other research leadership positions. Jennifer originally qualified and worked as a teacher and has worked both in the primary and secondary school settings. So these experiences no doubt inform her research questions and perspectives on school engagement and learning. So today she's going to give us a presentation on her research on Irish children's experiences of remote learning during the first lockdown of last year. So thank you, Dr. Symonds.
Thanks very much, Claire, Dr. Kelly, for that lovely introduction. Okay, so I'll share my screen. Hopefully this will all go well. All right, so I'm really here today to give a very brief overview of the results from a large-scale Irish national study of primary schooling. And in our study, we captured experiences during the first lockdown period, 9 weeks after the lockdown started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to very briefly introduce the study and the team and the funders, because this is a real team effort in producing these findings. And then I'm going to give a very brief overview of the results of the lockdown sub-study that's part of this much broader study. So just to give an overview of the broad study, the study is called Children's School Lives, and it's Ireland's national longitudinal study of primary schooling. It's the first of its kind in Ireland. We're very thrilled to have this resource available for producing empirical evidence on what people's experiences of schooling are like. It's funded by the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, the NCCA, through the Government of Ireland. And it's led by the UCD School of Education, and the management team on the study are Professor Dimpna Devine, myself, Professor Shanine Sloan, Professor Gabriela Martinez-Sands, and our other colleagues are all very much involved. It's a longitudinal study. It runs from 2018 to 2024 is when we stop collecting data, and the study will continue then to analyse the data until 2025. So it's a nationally representative sample of primary schools all across Ireland. We have two age cohorts. We have our youngest age cohort, cohort A, who started primary schools in 2019, and our middle childhood cohort, cohort B, who were in second class at age 8 and 9 in 2019. And we're following both of those age cohorts all the way through until the younger cohort are in second class, and until the older cohort transfer into their first year of post-primary school. We have approximately 4,000 children, 2,000 children in each age cohort. We have 189 schools at present, and about 240 classrooms represented across those schools. And through our sampling technique, our sample is actually nationally representative statistically of the island, of the Republic of Ireland. So what happened was that we were all set to go out and collect data from all of our schools in last February and March, and then the schools closed. And we were sat there with all of these boxes of data going, oh no, what do we do? Our school's going to reopen. How do we go ahead and do this? So over time, we made the decision, informed by our stakeholders in the study, that it would be okay to go in and do an online study of how people were experiencing the remote schooling at that time. So what we did was we actually collected data from as many people as we could, but it was just from our cohort B sample that we collected data with children and parents, because we had already collected data with cohort A earlier on in the year. So what you're seeing is data that have been generated with one of our age cohorts. And we have got approximately 25% of the children and parents who were involved in the larger study gave data for this sub-study, and approximately 60% of the principals and teachers gave data. We also had a qualitative case study of children and parents and principals and grandparents in 7 of those schools, because our case study approach is to take a subsample of the schools who are involved in the quantitative study to really bring out the rich descriptions of the processes that are happening at the time. All right, so as not to confuse you with too much detail about the methodology, let me get straight into the findings there of these online surveys and interviews that we did during the lockdown period last year in May. And it's very important to say that this is what people were experiencing during the very first lockdown, during the very first experience of the transition to remote learning. And I think if we were to do this study again today, we may find that we've got quite different experiences. So I want to first of all draw attention to that this is not a parallel to what we're experiencing right now. What these results are is information that we can draw on to help inform us in how we might be managing our remote schooling currently, learning the lessons from last time. So the sample that we had respond to our remote schooling surveys were predominantly female and white Irish adults. Children were evenly mixed in gender and were mainly white Irish. Half of our parents had university qualification, about a quarter had a technical qualification, about a fifth had completed secondary or primary school as their highest educational qualification. Around 2/3 of our parents were in full or part-time employment, and around a quarter were eligible for a medical card. So we had a really nice diverse spread of the population there represented. So what we found was when we were surveying principals and teachers and asking them questions in our case studies about digital technology, and these are just very snippets of findings. You can download our reports from our website, which have got many, many, many more findings under these themes, was we found that the principals generally felt that their staff in their schools had been using digital technology, that they had used it for quite some time, but that the schools themselves weren't really well resourced in digital technology. They were also quite positive about developing digital technologies and digital teaching further when the schools reopened. And then when we were talking to our teachers and our principals, we had some really interesting comments about teachers being quite engaged and wanting to use the technologies, but not really having enough time to mentally prepare themselves for how to do this during the first lockdown period. Whereas some teachers were also very, very new to using digital technologies, and for them it represented an extremely steep learning curve. And one of the things about using the digital technologies, or also moving to a more remote form of schooling, is about missing the interaction time with the children, which only really video conferencing and other kinds of discussion forums can give. Looking here at pedagogy, we found that the kinds of pedagogies used by the teachers were predominantly assigning workbook work. Now, again, I must remind you guys that this is for third class children at the time, so the children were aged 9 and 10. So this is a different kind of learning that might have been happening for much younger children or even children in secondary school. But here the majority of teachers were assigning worksheets and workbook work and other kinds of projects that the kids could go off and do by themselves. We also had quite a large number of teachers, 70%, who were using these digital learning platforms like Padlet and Seesaw. Much fewer were using Google Classroom because, again, of the younger age group of the children. And then we had a really, only a very few teachers, 30% or so, or 40% were using actual video technologies. So again, that chance for real-time interaction between the children was really restricted to a very much smaller number of classrooms. Some of the comments we got back regarding, the parents who were stepping into the role of being the classroom coordinator here, was that the lack of routines were actually really stressful, and having to try to organise themselves and their own workload and the routines of the classroom in their own homes was something that they just weren't really used to. And that was causing quite a degree of stress amongst the parents. Looking here at the subjects that the teachers were teaching, we asked them, did you focus any more or any less on particular subjects during the remote schooling period? And here we can see that the teachers were actually more likely to spend more time during remote learning teaching math and English than they were to teach subjects like drama and RE and music. In fact, drama and RE were the subjects that were taught mostly, that were taught least. And especially poor drama didn't really get much of a look in last time around. And again, thinking about the kind of interactive subjects that might get kids interacting with each other and recreating that classroom dynamic, we're really seeing here a focus on the subjects that are kind of core to these competencies that children are taking forward to then get qualifications and also to support their general learning in math and literacy. So we're seeing a narrowing of focus on subjects that was informed by necessary decisions about how to spend time. Thinking about engagement with the remote learning, again, engagement in terms of participation, I wanted to draw your attention here to the fact that it was 95% of children reported that their mothers were helping them with the remote schooling, whereas only around 50% of children were reporting that their male caregivers, their fathers, were helping them with remote learning. And most of our parent respondents were actually female, they were mothers, and these were parents who were working. So it's not like they were at home looking after their children for full time. So these are predominantly working parents juggling homeschooling, and we see the real burden here is falling to the mothers. For the children learning, the parents reported that the large group of children were learning between 10 and 30 minutes a day. So perhaps less than the teachers might have intended, whereas about a third of children were learning about 30 minutes to an hour a day. Far children were learning, over an hour a day. So for those parents who are worried that their children weren't putting in enough time, I would say don't worry, because actually there was a lot of children who were putting in, very small proportions of time. And we might think really carefully about how to best use the time that the children and the parents are able to give to this to make it the most high quality education we can have in that time. Educator hours during lockdown, here the principals were working much longer hours than they would normally work for a large majority of principals. So really this transition to remote learning was having a great degree of impact on the lived experiences of the principals. And then if you might match that up to the children themselves doing 30 minutes of home learning a day, more work for principals, really, tiny reduced amount of time for schooling for kids. This is a really interesting concept that I think we haven't really gotten to grips with. The experiences, the emotional experiences from the participants here, we've captured some of these in our case studies. For example, a parent is saying, I think he's keeping up well with the school learning. If the lockdown goes for 3 years, I think my kids will be fine. So this is one parent's perception, but then another family's perception, the grandparent is saying, well, it's too much of a drain on parents. Not all parents are qualified to teach the children long term. And if we look at the responses across the children and the parents, we can see here that there's a great mixture. Some of the children and parents think the school learning was fine, they got on with it well, they enjoyed it, but then there's a large proportion of them that didn't like it. So really mixed experiences depending on the child, depending on the parent, depending on the family. Now I've just got another couple of slides and then I'm done. I'll be quick as I can. I'm probably out of time, Claire. So well-being, we measured the same well-being measure across children, parents, principals and teachers. And here we can see that the children were actually reporting the highest levels of well-being and the parents and the principals are reporting the lower levels. The teachers are reporting levels somewhat in the middle here. So this is general global well-being. How do you feel about your life? How satisfied are is your life? And I think here we can see, there's a positive impact for children of being so well supported by all of these adults who are going out of their way to recreate schooling in the home. This lovely comment about the importance of gardens coming through and physical activity for children. Thinking about equality's voice and inclusion, some of the barriers that teachers and principals perceived to remote learning were having a lack of electronic devices in the home. They perceived that the parents might have a lack of internet connection, that the parents might have overwhelming work responsibilities, that they might not be interested in supporting home learning, that older siblings' schooling and family dynamics were also impacting on the parents' ability to engage with the home learning, and challenges of poverty were also mentioned. Although poverty compared to the resources is something different. So, you know, it's really about here perceiving that the parents are unable to connect because of a lack of technology and a lack of equipment. It was very important here for the teacher and parents' perceptions. And then just finally, to finish off here, thinking about transitions. Now, we've just had our second transition into remote schooling. This was the first transition that we had. And after 9 weeks into it, if we look at how settled the children and the parents and the teachers and the principals felt, actually, after 9 weeks, we have relatively high levels of feeling settled, but it's not easy. So the levels of ease are lower. Feeling normal, it kind of feels normal, but it doesn't really feel normal as well. So there's, again, a bit of a mixture going on, with it being something that we can settle into, but not particularly easily. Here, just to end off, we can see the parents saying, well, I will never adapt to homeschooling. No, I don't like it. I dislike it. So this is one parent who's very different to the one who we previously said that they could do it for 3 years. And then we have a child saying, well, when I go back to school, when I transition back into schooling, I'll feel a bit annoyed because I have to do a lot more work. But I'll feel happy because I'll get to see my friends again. So just again to acknowledge our much broader research team and our funders. Thanks, Claire, and I will hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Symonds. That was a really wonderfully clear presentation and some really important insights there that I'm sure people will draw on in some questions that we will answer in the question and answer session after we've heard from our second presenter today. So just to remind all of the attendees about the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen there. If you want to put in any questions, we'll deal with them just after we hear from Simon. So to introduce Simon Lewis, Simon is the principal of Carlow Educate Together Primary School. He's also the founder and host of the onshut.net website and podcast. So Simon devotes a huge amount of his time to sharing his experiences as an educator with other teachers and principals. And most recently, he's focused a lot of his efforts on helping other schools with this shift to remote learning. So he's going to share some of these experiences with us and tell us how we can work together to help children learn until they can return to school. So Simon.
Thanks so much, Claire, for the lovely introduction, and thank you very much to I.S.A.G for inviting me to present to you. I feel a little out of my depth, to be honest with you, because although I possess a degree in science, this may be the most unscientific presentation you'll ever see. I am just going to share my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see that, and it'll be okay for you. Just to give you a little bit of a background, I tick a few boxes. I'm a principal who was probably one of those 50-odd% who found the first lockdown horrific. I'm a parent who would have been more on the side of the parents who said, I don't know how people do this. How do teachers do what they do? And I guess I'm a teacher as well by qualification. I spent, I suppose, when schools were closed down, the school buildings were closed down in the middle of March. The day the announcement came out, I set up a site to basically get teachers together to try and collaborate, to try and get through this. And essentially, I realized very quickly that everybody was in a state of panic, and particularly my colleagues, my principal colleagues. So I've been, my school have been, I suppose, engaging in some form of bits of remote learning for about 3 or 4 years. We've been using Google Classroom and more recently Seesaw and Class Dojo and others, for about 4 years for homework. Obviously we were in school, but we were also doing, we threw out our homework journals about 4 years ago and moved to a kind of more blended and flipped learning model. In a way, that was about the only qualification I had to be able to offer a little bit of help and advice to my colleagues. So I decided on a Monday to email the Irish Primary Principal Network to offer a webinar, and on Tuesday evening I gave that webinar, and 1,400 principals signed up to it, which I suppose to me showed that this is going to be a very, very difficult time. Now, I spent the next five or so months of working with principals, school leaders and teachers, training with ideas and sharing ideas and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of my background. I know I'm very, very short on the clock. So I suppose I said the best thing I would do is maybe to tell you everything I learned about teaching in the first lockdown as quickly as possible. And, you know, as luck would have it, there it is. So thank you and goodbye. No, I'll do a little bit more than that. But it doesn't really work for anyone particularly. And I think just saying that to me, even saying that, the first time I realized that, it was quite empowering in a way, because we can't replace school with remote learning. If we could, then we should be doing it, you know. And it was something I can't remember who actually said, you know, if a teacher can be replaced by a robot or something like that, then they probably should. I think it was a computer. I think that's a famous phrase from someone much cleverer than me. And the same would go for face-to-face learning. It can't really be replaced properly with remote learning. And what I've been kind of figuring out is some bits of it work quite well, but what doesn't work, and what could we learn from our first experience of lockdown, let's say lockdown number one, as we refer to it in the trade. I suppose there's a lot of things people need for remote learning. This is the busiest slide I have, I promise. And I'm not going to read all of these things, but these are things that teachers need, that school leaders need, that families need, in order for remote learning to even start to happen. You know, I mean, one or two things that might jump out at you. I mean, the big one for me is having enough food in your house. And in my context, running a DESH school, that isn't always the case. I mean, my first priority in the first lockdown was to make sure our families got fed, because many of our families, their only food, some of the children's food, was what they got in school on their school lunches, or and that's a major thing to disappear. But then in terms of learning, I suppose there was you know, last time we didn't have access to textbooks for 2 months, you know, and I know where textbooks are pedagogically not the greatest tool in the world, but just to get you started, it's a nice little landing space to say, look, kids, you know, do this page of a book or whatever, and we can talk about it and things like that. It's a I suppose a manipulative that you can use in a way, because it's something that everybody has. But various other things. I mean, and Jennifer went through a lot of the things that people said they didn't have access to. And meanwhile, principals were scurrying around trying to ensure they were GDPR compliant and all the policies were in order and everything else, in order to be able to do any of the work that we could, while not actually knowing what we were doing. So initially, this was all very, very difficult. And but you know, the question, I suppose, is, yes, there's loads of notes, there were loads of notes from what actually worked the first time is the thing. And I've been pondering on this, and this is where where you'll see real unscience in action here. Because this is pure feeling and opinion, which are two things I'm sure that you've cherished greatly as scientists. Basically, from what I could gather from the workshops I gave to principals, the thing that worked was everybody was in the same boat the first time. We were all overwhelmed, we were all afraid, and we all agreed that schools had to be closed at that point back in March. Nobody was saying, we need to keep the schools open at all costs. We were all petrified of getting this virus. And the other thing that we had as well that worked, I feel, very well, was a bit of a novelty effect. We'd never done this before. And what could be nicer than actually spending a little bit more time with your family, playing school at home for a little while. And I mean that with respect. But I mean, for a couple of weeks at least, you know, that's okay. And I think that kind of got us through the first little while of remote learning. There was a lot of forgiveness. We'd no books, we'd nothing. We were basically trying to teach families how to use things like Google Classroom or CISO or Class Dojo, and having never touched them before. And I mean, we almost became like internet technical support groups for the first while. But there was a lot of patience and a lot of goodwill, and actually there were times where it was lovely for many families, where the sun was shining, and it was, you know, a lot of nice things. But really by May, most engagement dropped, and in many cases the learning stopped. And while that's not just a terrible poem, that's actually what was happening. We've started to see that engagement generally began to go down. And I found myself and my homeschool liaison teacher and our school completion program worker found ourselves making more and more phone calls to families just to make sure that they were engaged and okay and still around. And most of the reaction was, oh, look, we're just doing our own thing now. And, you know, Ashley, you're only doing revision now. You know, that kind of, there was an element of giving up in a way. The novelty had sort of worn off. But I wasn't really interested in those families that much. It was the families, I suppose, for me, vulnerable families. Learning often never started at all. And a large percentage of our families weren't able to begin to access the learning. Families, and for various reasons, whether that was through poverty, whether that was through, I suppose, atmosphere at home, or what was it, the structure of home, or lack of structure at home, or if children had additional needs where they weren't able to access an online learning. And then, of course, access to digital devices. Most families have access to the internet, but we found that while about 90% of children had access to devices, that went way down to 50% when you excluded phones. You know, most people were trying to access their education on a phone, on a shared phone, and that was very, very difficult. So, I mean, I feel you know, this was a large section of society that got forgotten about in lockdown 1. I suppose I'm just going back to that slide I had about what people need for remote learning. You know, in this lockdown, I suppose we had 5 months of learning a lot, and as someone said, flying the plane while we're building it. We had we were relying on, if this was ever to happen again, and I suppose we were caught in the hop again, that all of this stuff would be in place. And unfortunately, and I can be quite cynical and quite harsh, but I think I'm being fair. The only thing that's changed this time around is this. This is what children will have access to. We can guarantee. The rest we can't guarantee, and that's quite worrying. The whole thing about remote learning is it can't be done on the cheap. If we are going to have to do remote learning, you know, if we're in this situation on and off for the next few months, unfortunately, we can't do it for free. And this is the total amount of money that schools have been given for remote learning specifically, not for reopening school, but for for remote learning. And I'm not just saying, and that's not to be over dramatic or anything like that. When I say almost, a small amount of money was given to schools to purchase devices for children who may not have access. I work in a 400 pupil school. I got €600, just to put it into context. So I feel I was closer to zero than I suppose what figures might be coming out. Look, to me, the conclusion is that nothing has really changed since lockdown 1. We have a little bit more knowledge. We hate it a lot more than we did the first time the novelties run off. But all that aside, it's the vulnerable children who are not going to be able to access this learning again. So the same problems are going to happen. The gap is going to remain wide and can become wider again, and that is problematic. Fine, a lot of children will survive this fine. I'm lucky. My son is lucky. He lives in the same in a family where we can give him what we can give him, and he'll be okay. But I'm aware of the 60% of families in my school for example, and across the country, I don't know the percentages of disadvantage in Ireland, that just will be in the same situation. Again, children with additional needs, forgotten again this time. And these are things that we really need to look at. The mantra schools are safe is becoming quite tiresome, I think, for everybody. And I suppose there's so many, I don't want to be political at all about this, but the perception from everybody is, whether it's true or not, is that they aren't. And that's why we're not in them. And we need to stop that sentence. And I saw that people are saying we need to convince schools that they're safe. No, we need to ensure schools are safe if we're to return to them. And for me, the solution lies in a blended approach. Now I've done I know I'm very short of time, so I'm not going to go into too much detail into it. But what it essentially means is who is going to come to school and how often will they come? How often will they come to school? And we have to prioritize. We can't have everybody in school at the moment. I don't know if we can have anybody in school at the moment. I mean, by the looks of things, we can't. But when things start to ease off, do we look at children with additional needs? Do we look at children of frontline workers, children of staff members, children with disadvantage? But I could keep that list going and going and going. But as we add more and more layers, it becomes more and more complicated. And again, we have to figure out, you know, how do we make that safe for them to get these variables in? So again, what protections will there be for staff? Again, we have to provide our own PPE, for example. I mean, it's not the be all and end all, but you know, it would help if that was provided for us. Should we prioritize vaccinations? I don't know if we should, but it's another thing. Should we have a situation where there's a maximum number of people per classroom according to the size? And there's loads and loads of variables. And again, it would be dependent on the transmission, I would imagine, in the community of whether that's the case. So it's really hard and really complicated. And I don't think schools can do them, can make these decisions on their own. There needs to be guidance from above of, you know, this is what we suggest, and maybe schools are given a little bit of autonomy, but all in or all out certainly doesn't work either way. Can it be done? I mean, to me, yes, I think it can, but it needs time, planning and investment. And certainly telling us the Friday before schools were to open what was going to happen didn't give us time to plan, and we are certainly not getting any investment to help us with it. So they're my thoughts. I hope they're okay for you, and I'll hand you back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. I think that was incredibly valuable, having the insights of somebody working at the coalface in a school, a principal who has gone through the last lockdown and the shift to remote learning and is doing it again, and pretty, I think, shocking details there of the lack of preparation from the Department of Education, the lack of support for schools to deal with a second closure of or shift to remote learning in the schools. So thank you very much, Simon, for all of that. It was really helpful, and especially I think the highlighting of the challenges faced by vulnerable families. I really think it's quite unforgivable that they've been left behind again. So just before we start the Q&A session, I've just been asked to highlight for everybody a Royal Irish Academy online conversation event taking place this week. It's called, it's the 6th conversation, COVID-19 and the New Year's Challenges, Vaccines, Variants and Critical Care. And this online discussion will be chaired by an I.S.A.G member, Professor Patricia Kearney, and it will feature panelists, including Dr. Mike Ryan of the WHO. So we will share the Eventbrite link for that conversation in the chat, if anybody would like to join that. So moving on to the question and answer section of today's webinar, and I can see that we have some great questions coming in, both through the Q&A and the chat. So I'm going to try and get to as many of them as possible. Some have been answered a little bit already. There was one, Jennifer, sorry, I know that you've already answered it in a text, but perhaps because I think people would be interested in this question about the well-being. You know, you highlighted that the well-being of children as reported in your study was actually, you know, quite hopeful and promising. And one of the questions was whether you could compare it to pre-lockdown scores. And I know you've answered this question already, but it'd be nice to speak to the audience about that.
Sure, thanks. So in our study, we measure well-being in a variety of ways. So it's a very difficult question to ask a researcher, how does well-being change over time? The way that we measured it in our lockdown study was through a measure of life satisfaction. And we chose that as our measure because we realized that the children were sitting next to the parents on the computer filling in this survey. We didn't want to ask them questions that would be too sensitive, that might raise any issues around the family. So we measured that very, very broadly, like the broadest measure that you could possibly get. Because we chose to change our measure, we didn't have a comparable measure pre-lockdown, and we'll go back to the way that we normally measure well-being after this. So from our study, I can say that we won't be able to give any definitives on any kind of pre and post changes in children's well-being. There are studies in the UK that may have some of those data for UK children. So that's really where we're at with it. I think on a broader perspective of how does the well-being of children fare during the lockdown period, again, you might want to think about all the different things that constitute well-being. There's kind of emotional well-being, social well-being. There's also whether the children themselves feel confident and happy and secure in themselves as individual peoples, whether they feel strong in themselves as individuals, their identities. So there's so many ways that a lockdown can impact their well-being in positive ways and in negative ways. So it's a very complex question to answer.
Thank you, Jennifer. There's some questions coming in that are, I suppose, contrasting the experience of second level with primary. Now, I know that your main experience here, both Jennifer and Simon, has been with primary. Do you have any insights into the differences between those, or why some things will work for one setting and not the other? Or if there are better practices for primary relative to secondary and vice versa?
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, Claire, and sorry for jumping in. Jennifer probably has much better experience here. I guess, I mean, for me, I look at primary education and secondary education as two very different beasts, in much the same way as I compare a doctor and a nurse. They both are very different jobs. They both are involved in the medical field, but what they both do are very different. So I mean, I can only envisage that I would I assume that when the older children get, I mean, the difference, I can tell you about the difference between a 4-year-old learning and a 12-year-old learning. So I mean, that's possibly as close as the gap I can go. But the older the children we found in primary school, the more independent they were able to actually take on some of the learning. So they were able to use devices themselves. They were able to engage with their teacher without having a parent beside them. So it's possibly easier for parents in terms of independence. However, and I'm only experiencing this on one point in my life. I was a teenager. Teenagers, I presume, are more rebellious than younger children in terms of wanting to do the learning. So it becomes, I suppose, a battle of wills there, and maybe there's the things that are there. I think with second level, from what I'm hearing from colleagues, though, to be serious on it, the content seems to be delivered differently, and there's a definite. There's the difference being that I think there's teachers are much more focused on a kind of a narrower thing about exams and tests and assessments, and providing content to young learners, whereas in primary school you're trying to create a more holistic kind of task-based and choice-oriented sort of model. So it's I mean, they're two different pedagogies, but I mean, I suppose that's the best summary I can give.
Thanks, Simon. A couple of questions have come in about the vaccine rollout and whether teachers, I suppose particularly the special the SEN teachers, whether they should be prioritised for vaccination. Would you have any thoughts on that, Simon, or if anyone else wants to answer?
I certainly don't have any massive opinion on it, to be honest. I mean, everybody wants to be first in the queue, I guess, for this vaccination. Almost everybody. So I mean, it's very hard because it becomes a competition. I mean, it would make sense for people working with children with additional needs due to the fact that it's a caring, it's more of a care profession really than an educational one. And I mean, if you were in my classes for children with autism from September to December, there was no social distancing whatsoever. I mean, it wasn't possible. And you know, if a vaccination would make people perceive schools to be safer, then you know maybe it would work. But from what my understanding is, I don't know if it does. I mean, this is where scientists should answer rather than me with a big mouth and an opinion.
So I wonder, would anybody else pick up on that question? I suppose about how we move towards getting the schools reopened. You know, that what are the various steps involved? So vaccinating, particularly the special educational needs teachers, so that we can prioritise the most vulnerable children and returning them to school. You know, as Simon highlighted earlier, you know, we can have a priority list of children who can return to schools, but you know, reports in the UK are that you know, allowing children, for example, vulnerable children, children of frontline workers and so on, back to school results in the schools being just almost as full as they were before, and you know, isn't really doing anything to help with suppression of the virus. So I wonder if anybody would pick up on that, maybe Jerry or. Is Jerry there? No, sorry. Oh, Jerry.
So maybe I can say just one comment is we do not know that vaccinations actually suppress transmission. They're more likely to suppress severe disease. So using that as a mechanism for opening schools is not necessarily going to solve this problem of transmission. And so one would like to do the other, which is to actually stop transmission first and then open schools, because once you don't have transmission in the community, then you can open schools safely. And that's the only way we really know today to open schools safely.
Maybe Sam McConkey here, I was more or less going to say exactly the same thing, that the key thing is getting the rates of COVID-19 transmission in our communities down to very low levels. And then of course the schools can function again. But I'm aware, as I say, that back in May and June, when we had our rates quite low, it proved really difficult to get schools back open again in the second, third and fourth week in June. There was a lot of fear and anxiety, and I don't quite know exactly why that was so difficult, but it just didn't happen, even though the rates were exceptionally low then. So I think this is a fairly complex and difficult area, and part of it can be fear, which sometimes can be, you know, a problem above and beyond the actual objective sort of threat there. And I agree with what Yanir says, that the vaccine isn't really, making everyone contingent vaccine is a false idea that's very easy to jump on, but I think that's fundamentally wrong to suggest that just if we could vaccinate the teachers or some of the teachers and some of the students or all of the students, that would fix the problem. Unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, I don't think that's the case.
Thank you, Sam. There was an interesting, oh, sorry, Jerry, go on.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. Sorry, I got bumped off the internet a little bit. Yeah, I agree with both Sam and Yanir. And I just, you know, as a modeler, I have to say that middle ground between the start of vaccination and kind of reaching full vaccine coverage is the most difficult part to predict. It's full of uncertainty and it's extremely gray. You know, it would be a major gamble. If you did make priority groups, it would be the special needs kids. But it would really need to be a very small fraction of the overall school population for that to be in any way feasible. And particularly with this new of any kind. And then there are lots of things that you can't see in fine scale epi data that you only see at macro scale. And it's been pretty clear that closing educational institutions is the second most important thing you can do to curb transmission. So given that we're really in a big battle now, an even bigger battle than the one we were with this new variant, yeah, I just don't see that we have the room to play with that. And there's too much uncertainty at present.
Thank you, Jerry. So a question has come in from Roisin, short all the way, and we've touched on some of it already, but I'll read it out. Would you accept that the UK is a good model to emulate, where schools stayed open for vulnerable children and children of frontline workers from the beginning? Was there any direction or guidance from the Department of Education on lessons from the first lockdown to prepare schools for this one? Is there any additional funding for this lockdown? By the way, all vulnerable children got devices and data in the UK. Simon, maybe you've touched on some of that in your presentation, but maybe you would just answer that.
Sure, thanks, Claire, and thanks for the question, Roisin. There's several questions within it, so I'll try and answer them as quick as I can. I think any model where vulnerable children get to access education is one worth exploring, and I suppose the balance is, how safe is it for that to happen? And from what I'm hearing from this group is that currently it doesn't seem safe in terms of transmission, particularly with this new variant. So if we bring people together, we may find ourselves exacerbating the problem, and then we don't get anything done. So there's some questions though that might help with that. I mean, I like the fact all vulnerable children got devices and data in the UK. No, very, very few in Ireland got devices, and none got data. And any direction or guidance from the Department of Education on lessons the first lockdown? No, I mean, the only guidance I've seen is actually Jennifer's work. I mean, from like proper research. It's probably others I haven't come across, but not really. I mean, I'm not answering anything here with particular use, but it does seem that the Department of Education really is all in, and that's the plan. And then throwing in kind of a curveball last week of, okay, let's throw in these groups without any further supports, or is where we're at. So I mean, it just needs time. I mean, I think we can definitely do it. It just needs time and investment and planning. That's kind of, I mean, we were all ready to go. I mean, to be honest, we were ready to go in on Monday for our 2 special classes for autism. We had a meeting, we had our meetings. We tried to structure it as best we could with like the little notice we had before it was pulled. We would have gone in, but so I mean, it's not that people don't want to go in, or are too scared to not go in. Everyone was willing, even if we're a bit scared to.
Claire, if I could just come in on this one super quick. Thanks so much. So in our study, we did find that it was perceptions that the parents didn't have the technological equipment that they needed to do the remote learning coming from the schools. So we did find strong evidence that that there was the perception that the barriers to education were about the equipment. So for example, getting additional devices for the most vulnerable children would be simply amazing. And we also found from the parents' perspectives, for the parents, the biggest barrier was not having enough time. So I think that the conversation could also include vulnerable parents. It's not just about vulnerable children, it's about vulnerable parents who have got, extremely tough caring responsibilities, working and living conditions, who are supporting, their vulnerable children. So the resources for parents, I think, need to be the priority, because the parents are the people who are going to recreate that classroom situation for the child in the home. Without the parents' participation, and without the parents being supported, the child is not going to be able to access the learning from the teachers.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer.
One thing that I would add, sorry, Claire, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
One thing that I would add is that it's one of the dangers or difficulties, if you will, is to create a label on a large group of kids, like vulnerable or something like that. And this goes to the challenge of having sort of rules that are across for a large group of people under extraordinary circumstances. And it is important to have not just rules, but also guidance about which direction we want to push. Do we want to have as few as possible that are going to end up in the school. Or, you know, so part of the point is that if we know that the primary challenge during the crisis is to prevent transmission, then we will take individual cases and we will adapt to them appropriately, rather than applying across the board rules that will not serve the purposes that we need to serve.
Thank you, Yanir. We have,
just to...
sorry, I know we're reaching the end of the time, but there was a question about hybrid learning and the extent to which, you know, it works if children can choose, or students can choose whether to learn online or in person. And this has been done in other places in the world, like Ontario and Canada. I don't know, Simon or Jennifer, would you have any thoughts on that, or if anybody else? I mean, it seems like it would create a lot of extra workload for teachers, which might be difficult to manage. Simon, do you?
Yeah, I would suggest, yeah, a hybrid or a blended learning approach is the solution at the moment. But that, again, it brings lots and lots of questions, as I was saying, you know, who gets to come to school? I mean, you know, free choice wise, you'll find, you know, I mean, I found, for example, the last 2 days, if we leave it to free choice, the last 2 days of term, where everybody, you know, nothing happens in primary schools, I had 95% attendance, you know, in the school, and there was really no need for anyone to send their children to school. The, you know, numbers were getting really out of hand at that point, and it was the same across the board. It was commented upon. So again, you know, we have to ask questions, and I know broad strokes are not, you know, from what Yanir was saying there, is not possibly the right thing. The other thing is, we are going to have a blended approach. We have to then redefine what teachers are and what their purpose is. You can't expect a teacher to be an online teacher and a face-to-face teacher at the same time. We have not managed to perfect the bilocationalism or any of these other talents. So we have to look at the various roles are in schools, and to be looser about those definitions as well. I mean, we have a lot of people working in schools. We also have, you know, final year students who are training, who might get some good opportunities for practice. I mean, we can pull on different areas within our sector. We've lots of people out in secondment as well who might be able to help as well. So, I mean, the solutions are there, but it's creativity, but also, you know, recognizing, you know, the other, that it's more complicated than just doing something, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Simon. I know we have some more questions, but I'm just conscious of the time. So if anybody has questions that they feel we haven't answered during the session, please do follow up with us. You can get in touch with us via the I.S.A.G website, as well as the Twitter account. And just before we end, I'm going to hand over to Anthony Staines, who might talk to us about this potential for the pandemic within the pandemic, this fourth wave, perhaps driven by this more transmissible variant. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you. I suppose the first thing is there are huge uncertainties here. We know what has happened. We believe that, as far as we can tell, the new variant of concern, what's called the UK strain of this virus, is not the main reason for the recent spike in infections in Ireland. It is contributing, I'm confident about that, but it's not the main reason. So the concern is that when the new strain kicks in, which it's starting to do now, that we will have another spike. So perhaps that our cases will go up again, or our case numbers will come down very, very slowly. We don't know. And nobody, I certainly don't know, and I don't think anybody does know what will happen. Where we are is that we have a moderately strict lockdown, not as strict as the initial lockdown in March of last year. We are not putting in the public health resources into things like testing contacts of cases. That's been stopped. The contact tracing is still inadequate. We are still contact tracing people for a short period of time backwards. And one of the reasons that schools have been reported in the way they have is that if you only ask kids where they were the previous 48 hours, you miss quite a lot of school contacts from your analysis. So there are many school outbreaks. They're just not getting into the figures because of the way the figures are collected. And that says to us that the contact tracing is not working well enough to make a difference. So what we know is that we need to bring the numbers of this virus down. There's no one disagrees with that. Absolutely everyone thinks we need to bring the numbers down. There is disagreement over what we should do next. My colleagues and I argue that we bring the numbers down, we bring them down to zero, and we keep them as close to zero as we can. And that allows us to get our lives back. Others have other views, but it's going to be more difficult to bring the viruses down, and it's going to be almost with the new UK strain, and it's going to be almost impossible to bring the numbers down unless we have a serious uptick in public health. And I'm not criticizing my public health colleagues. We have the same number of people in public health that we had in March. So essentially the whole period of time between now and then has been wasted. We have not put the resources into public health on the ground. We've put the resources instead into a centralized call center based contact tracing system, which does good work, by the way, but is not adequate for what it's being asked to do. And we have, depending on whom you talk to, either 2 or 3 different software applications in use throughout the system to coordinate tracking, tracing, follow-up between the call centers, regional public health, and the various parts of the laboratory system. And again, that does not suggest that we have made good use of the time we've had to tidy this up. So I don't know the future. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not terribly optimistic. I hope I'm wrong, but we're all going to find out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Did anybody else want to, Yanir, were you going to say something before we close?
Quick comment. I think the statement about the need for the contact tracing and effectiveness of it, I do think that it's super important for everyone to understand that they have share in the responsibility of identifying cases quickly, i.e. not just the public health, but the community. Every member of the community should be focused on identifying cases and understanding the contact. And that will make it possible to do much more than what the public health can do.
Okay, thank you, Yanir. I think it's almost 1:10, so we'll, Jerry, do you want to jump in before we close?
Sure, thanks, Claire. And sorry, I couldn't see the screen, so I thought it was IFA, my apologies. Just to comment on that, I think, and I've seen some great questions in a long list of questions, some of which are very well epidemiologically informed, about what we're being told about what happens in schools. And you've got to remember with COVID that epidemiologically, we're always just seeing the tip of the iceberg. Most people don't have overt symptoms. And that's particularly true in the least vulnerable members of the population, which means young kids. So you've got to remember, as you go down the age profile, the less clarity and the less vision we have of those transmission processes. So, the things aren't as clear-cut as sometimes we're told. And I think they're good by very advanced studies that, very few groups, that can only be done by large specialized research groups here and there in different parts of the world. So we have to be heavily reliant on the international evidence base rather than just relying on what we have here at home. And I can't answer all the questions that were raised, but I'll just say they're great questions. Thanks, Claire.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Well, with that, I'll draw this webinar to a close. I want to thank once again all of our panelists for their contributions, particularly our special guests, Dr. Jennifer Symonds and Simon Lewis. Thank you everybody for your contributions, and thank you to the audience for all of your great questions and for joining us. Just a final thought, I think, you know, we've had some fairly heard some very sobering details about failures to, you know, invest in our public health system, failures to invest in our education so that you know, the children could be better supported this time around in the lockdown. I think we've been incredibly lucky that our children, families, teachers, healthcare workers, absolutely everybody has been extraordinarily resilient for this past year. But let's not take that resilience for granted any longer. You know, let's work together, put pressure on our leaders, on our government to make this lockdown our last, to eliminate this virus so that our children can get back to school, they can have their freedom back to play and see their friends again. So thank you all. We'll see you next time.